Ireland, a place known for its beautiful scenery which has a long, complex, and fascinating history. And for many people, especially those who don't live there, it also has a reputation for wonder and mystery. It probably wouldn't surprise you then if I told you that this reputation has been around for hundreds of years. In the Middle Ages, Ireland was perceived by many as a land of wonders, in large part thanks to a book by Gerald of Wales called the Topographia Hibernica, the Topography of Ireland. It portrayed Ireland as a land free of all poisons and most diseases, covered in impenetrable forests and dotted with magical springs. Its inhabitants were wild men, werewolves, and human-animal hybrids. This book was the equivalent of a bestseller in the Middle Ages, and for many it remained the extent of their knowledge about Ireland, and it stayed the authoritative text on the Irish and Ireland for centuries. The famous humanist Plutarch supposedly had a copy and liked it very much, and it was the first of Gerald's books to ever be put into print. Irish writers were also responding to it and criticizing it well into the 1700s. So today, let's take a look at this book and see what exactly it actually says about the wonders of Ireland. The extent of most people's knowledge about Ireland before the writing of the Topographia Hibernica in the 1180s was rather limited. Figures like Isidore of Seville and Bede had mentioned Ireland in their writings, but usually not with much depth. It was an island to the west of Britain, it was converted to Christianity by St. Patrick, and it had no snakes, a fact often attributed to St. Patrick. It's clear that they'd never actually been there, something which Gerald points out when critiquing some of their claims, like that there's no bees on the island or that it's full of wild goats. The Irish were mainly known through religious figures who left the island, especially in the early Middle Ages. Irish missionaries headed by St. Columba converted what are today Scotland and northern England, and Columbanus, a different guy with a confusingly similar name, founded several monasteries in modern France and Italy, namely the extremely influential abbeys of Luxeuil and Bobbio. But by the 12th century, when Gerald was around, the peak of Irish missionary work had passed, and the increased centralization of Rome in the Catholic Church had led Ireland to be perceived as deviant, since it was slower than the rest of the Latin Christian world to conform to Roman norms. When Bernard of Clairvaux wrote the life of his late friend Malachy, an Irishman who brought the first Cistercian monasteries to Ireland, he referred to the Irish as Christians in name but pagan in fact, with Malachy being the obvious exception, essentially reconverting the Irish. All of this is to basically say that by around the mid-12th century, most people had a very limited knowledge about Ireland, but all of that was about to change. In around 1169, the deposed king of Leinster, Diarmait MacMurcha, pardon my Irish, requested the help of Henry II of England in reclaiming his kingdom. This event initiated a complicated series of events which resulted in an Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, and eventually King Henry claiming the whole island as a lordship within his kingdom. Now, the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland is something I will dedicate an entire future video to, but for now, all you really need to know is that by the end of the 12th century, England controlled much of southern and eastern Ireland, and this is the context in which the Topographia Hibernica was written. And this isn't just fluffy background information either. Gerald of Wales, also known as Gerald de Barri, was inspired to write the Topographia after having visited Ireland on 2 separate occasions, both related to the invasion. Gerald was of mixed Norman-Welsh background, his maternal grandfather being Gerald Fitzwalter de Windsor, an important player in the Anglo-Norman invasion of southern Wales, and his grandmother was Princess Nest, the daughter of Rhys ap Tewdwr, pardon my Welsh, the last king of South Wales whose death had prompted the invasion. By the time of the invasion of Ireland, the Welsh Normans, or Cambro-Normans, were the first to take up arms and led the early events, with Gerald of Wales's brothers and uncles playing a prominent part. His first visit in 1183 was in the company of his brother Philip, who'd gone to assist their uncle Robert Fitzstephen in suppressing a rebellion and to claim some land near Cork which had been promised to him. When Gerald came back to Wales, King Henry enlisted his aid in negotiations with southern Welsh lords, including Gerald's own cousin Rhys ap Gruffydd, beginning Gerald's career in the royal court. His loyalty and prudence in the matter led the king to send him on his second journey to Ireland in the company of Prince John. Yeah, you know, that Prince John. In 1185, to try and rein in the Norman lords, including his own family members, who often acted with quite a bit of independence from the crown, and sometimes even in opposition to it. Okay, so what does the Topographia actually say about Ireland? Well, first thing to note is that there are, based on the manuscripts that we have, more or less 5 different versions, with Gerald adding bits and editing some throughout his life. All of the versions are divided into 3 parts. The first is on geography, the second on wonders, and the third about the history of Ireland and the Irish. For this video, we're going to focus mostly on the first 2. One of the most interesting and enduring wonders of Ireland is its lack of snakes, an idea which was long established by Gerald's time. The Topographia goes one step further, though, by saying that Ireland lacks any poisonous creatures, including scorpions, toads, frogs, tortoises, or dragons, all of which were thought to be poisonous in the Middle Ages. Ireland being free of scorpions might not seem unsurprising to us, but it goes even further than that. Gerald says that any poisonous or venomous creature, they didn't have a distinction between the two at the time, any of them that touches Irish soil will die, sometimes immediately, sometimes shortly after. He tells one story of a frog being tossed off of a merchant's ship, and the moment it reached the ground, it died. He also tells another story of a frog found alive, which was deemed to be a bad omen, supposedly prophesying the coming of the English, and then he explains this naturalistically by stating that it must not have been a poisonous frog, which would have been exceptional, but that ultimately it couldn't have been born in Ireland because the soil in Ireland doesn't contain the seeds or germs of frogs. For those who don't know, medieval people thought that many crawling creatures like frogs, snakes, and worms were spontaneously generated out of mud or rotting wood rather than born through mating. And he specifies that the lack of poison in Ireland is a natural phenomenon, either due to the air or maybe due to the soil itself, also noting that the Irish soil, when taken abroad, can kill poisonous creatures, and also that leather boots made from Irish livestock can be cut up and mixed with water in order to create an antidote for any poison. Gerald acknowledges the association of this idea to St. Patrick, saying that most people think he rid the island of poisons, but he dismisses this as a mere legend, and he claims that the island was always like this. In doing so, he compares Ireland to the East, a land full of poisons and poisonous creatures, and he says that it's in the East that poison originates and is strongest. Ireland, being far to the west, is furthest away from poison's source of potency. The physical location of Ireland is actually very important to Gerald. He sees it as the farthest land to the west, with Iceland being perceived as more north, and the mythical island of Thule being, in his mind, probably fictional. This position also makes it peripheral, and Gerald himself states that the peripheries of the world are far more wondrous than its center. In a more cultural and psychological way, this makes a lot of sense. Ireland is a highly liminal space, both as an island, but also in its distance from areas which someone like Gerald, who spent years learning the liberal arts and theology in Paris, would see as central and civilized. Stepping into Ireland was stepping into the unknown, the wild, the foreign, despite Ireland not being that far away from the Anglo-Norman world, which was part of the civilized center. But we'll get back to that in a minute. Another one of the wonders related to Ireland's geography is the healthiness of its airs, which resulted in few people ever getting sick. If you've watched my series on the history of medicine, you'll know how much importance was placed on airs as one of the 6 non-naturals, which affected the body's health. Gerald also talks about several smaller islands on and around Ireland with interesting properties. On a lake in the north of Munster, for example, there's one island on which no female creature can live, whether human or animal, and if they set foot on it, they'll die instantly. A lot of instant death in Ireland, and this isn't even the last time it'll come up. Anyway, there's another island on the same lake where no one ever dies. This isn't necessarily as rosy as it might seem, however, because Gerald notes how people on the island suffering from mortal illnesses will just suffer eternally, to the point where they sometimes request people to take them off the island so that their suffering can end. He also mentions several water springs with strange properties. There's one that produces water that's always sweet, one so cold that wood put in it will become petrified, and then there's one that can only be drunk from by humans. Any animals that do will fall sick and die. Apparently, pebbles taken from the spring will also quench one's thirst when they're held in the mouth. Probably the strangest of these springs, though, is once again in Munster. Gerald says that if anyone touches or even looks at it, it'll start to rain heavily, and the rain won't stop until a priest, who is a virgin in both body and mind, celebrates Mass at the nearby chapel, which was built expressly for that purpose. He also notes that the locals often try to appease the spring by sprinkling holy water and milk from a cow that's entirely one color, but he sees this as a superstitious rite. With all of these, Gerald is sure to point out that they're natural phenomena tied to the land itself. Their causes are hidden, mysterious, and occult in the traditional sense of the term, but they're still natural. Gerald also spends some time discussing miracles connected to various saints, and specifically churches or mills which they founded, like the mill of St. Luthernus in Ossory, which won't grind grain on Sundays or any grain that's been stolen. Of course, miracle stories like this are hardly unique to Ireland, and they were pretty much universal in the Christian world, but Gerald is sure to point out how vengeful the saints of Ireland seem to be, with a lot of people dying, instantly or otherwise, when doing something wrong or going somewhere they're not supposed to be, which he attributes to the violent and anger-prone character of the Irish themselves. Some of the most fascinating wonders, though, are those that involve humans, and, well, humans. On the actual human front, Gerald talks about a woman following the court of Dumnall of Limerick who had a beard. The woman had a beard, that is. I mean, Dumnall probably also had a beard, but anyway, point is, the woman had a beard, and she also had a crest of hair going all the way down her spine, and she elicited laughter and wonder from those who saw her. You honestly gotta feel kind of bad for the woman. In one of the later versions, he also mentions a hermaphrodite, with one side of their face being bearded and the other side being completely smooth. Gerald also mentions two cases of human ox hybrids. One who was more like a man with hooves and other ox-like features, who stayed at the court of one of Gerald's uncles, Maurice Fitzgerald, and the other was a man-calf, born of bestiality, which spent a year with its cow mother and the other calves before it was brought into human society. As interesting as all of these stories are, there's one which is probably the most famous, the so-called werewolves of Ossory. The story goes that a priest ran across a pair of wolves that started talking to him, something which, understandably, terrified him. After speaking some Christian orthodoxy, though, the wolves convinced him that they were actually humans. According to the male wolf, a curse was placed on their people by St. Natalis, where every 7 years one man and one woman are turned into wolves and exiled, and they'll only turn back if they survive those 7 years. The wolf then tells the priest that the female wolf, his wife, is sick and dying, and he asks the priest to give her the viaticum, which is the Eucharist given to someone near death. The priest is still pretty unsure about the whole thing, but the wolf then shows him that they're human by basically unzipping the wolfskin from his wife and showing a human woman within, which seems to pretty much do the job to convince him. As I mentioned earlier, the liminality of Ireland was one of the things which made it seem so mysterious and wondrous in the first place, and the Topographia's popularity was strongly connected to this. With the Crusades in full swing by the time of its writing, medieval Europeans were becoming more and more fascinated with the wonders of far-off lands, and there were several books like the Topographia being written about the East and its wonders. This is one of the reasons why Gerald compares the West, Ireland, to the East, contrasting them as different parts of this peripheral world, and pointing out to the readership of Europe that there was another marvelous land right on their doorstep, one which, as I mentioned at the beginning, few people knew anything about. The marvel of Ireland, however, was also intimately connected to the idea of its people being barbarous and wild. Its peripherality, if that's even a word, was connected to its perceived distance to civilization. This idea fills the third part of the Topographia, the part talking about Irish history, and you might have noticed Gerald making some jabs at the Irish in the parts I mentioned as well. He notes, for example, that bestiality is a vice rampant amongst the Irish. And Ireland was also seen as a land of decentralized petty kings, lack of commerce, pastoralism over agriculture, polygamy, unreformed quasi-pagan church practice, and a penchant for beards. Some of these things were true, like Irish church law did allow for polygamy, but they were often exaggerated in order to create a deeper rift between Ireland and the more civilized parts of Christian Europe than actually existed, which in turn made Ireland seem more peripheral and wondrous. Gerald didn't invent the barbarous Irish stereotype, but the Topographia's popularity definitely kept it alive for a long time, which is why since the 1500s many Irish intellectuals and nationalists have held a deep hatred for him. But did people actually believe what Gerald said about Ireland? Well, that's actually a rather complicated question to answer. People in the Middle Ages were often more open to these sorts of wonders than we are today, and Gerald himself is a good example of this. In the Topographia, he repeats a few fairly standard explanations for these kind of things. On the one hand, he notes that these things only seem incredible because they're uncommon, pointing out that if it weren't for the fact that we see it every day, we would see the sunrise as equally as marvelous as solar eclipses, which are more rare but just as natural, and they can even be calculated and predicted. He also notes that God, the creator of the universe and nature, can do anything. He can put anything in nature, and he isn't limited to what's usual, which was an argument often used to defend the existence of miracles. But the fact that Gerald even needs to argue for the reality at all is due to the fact that he was well aware that not everyone would believe what he said. In fact, he goes through a great deal of effort to point out how reliable his sources are, and how some of the things he discusses were seen by his own eyes. In his passage on barnacle geese, which were said to have been born from barnacles growing off the wood of a specific tree, he notes that he actually saw a piece of driftwood with them on it. Of course, some people still held doubts. Albertus Magnus cast doubt about the barnacle geese in his book on animals, and the Emperor Frederick II, an avid falconer, wrote in his manual on falconry that he had a piece of wood with barnacles brought to him from the north, only to determine that there was no way that these were the embryos of birds. There was also a famous critic to the Topographia at Gerald's oral recitation of it at Oxford in around 1188, who Gerald mentions in the preface to his book on the invasion of Ireland, the Expugnatio Hibernica. This critic seems to have been especially critical of the parts involving human-animal hybrids and the werewolf story, and the historian Keegan Brewer has an excellent article about the impact this might have had on changes between the second and third versions of the Topographia. In later versions, Gerald adds more non-Irish wonders in order to complement and defend the reality of those that he saw or heard about in Ireland. In some other instances, he distances himself from some stories, saying that it's just something that people say. There's even a story about a fish with golden teeth that in later versions becomes a fish with gold-looking teeth. That being said, there's no real reason to believe that most people doubted everything that Gerald wrote in the Topographia. It was a very popular book, after all, and Gerald was a highly educated man, meaning that it's unlikely that he was the only one to believe these stories that were written in the Topographia. Likewise, it was a very influential book, and the ideas which it promotes were wide held for a long time. People might not have believed everything that was written in the Topographia, but certain ideas, like Ireland being free of poison, remained prominent for a very long time. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you're more interested in Gerald of Wales, we will be coming back to him when I make my video on the invasion of Ireland, but for now we're going to be leaving him aside. If you liked the video, I encourage you to give it a like and to subscribe to the channel, or to even share the video with any of your friends who you think might be interested in it as well. Other than that, I wish you all well, and I'll see you all soon.